This episode of Legends, the series, is brought to you by these fine companies.
I want you to give me your best impersonation of your dad in the midst of a storm.
When I was 10 years old and I was up in race control announcing, and I was here for the very first Night Under Fire. So it was probably the first Night Under Fire, or the first event where we had booked in Bob Moats. I had mispronounced his name, and our old race control was this 16 by 16 space on the third floor, and I was terrified. I was a little kid, and he said, "For God's sake, say something. Jesus Christ, can you say anything? Just speak." And then I mispronounced Bob's name, and he said, "It's Moats. How could you screw that up? It's Bob Moats." And I was 10 years old, so I was a little kid. My father pretty much, his tirades, I was really, shortly after I started, I was not, I mean, I am the ultimate critic, and I'm accountable to myself and God for every action. And so my father, very early in my career, said, because I asked him one time, I said, "How come I don't get," he said, "Bill, you're going to be way harder on yourself than I can ever be." But he was always a passionate guy, always fiery, always driven. That came from, I think, from his mom. You know, that came from Grandma Bader. Grandma Bader was a very strong, driven woman, and I think that's where that came from. And you know, something I never really understood was what fueled my dad. You know, what really drove that? And it wasn't money. I just think his sense of things was, we get one shot, we get one go around, and as long as he was living and breathing, everything was going to be the Bader way.
You know, I wouldn't compare your dad to Jesus Christ, even though he said the term Jesus Christ a whole lot of times. Yeah. But as Jesus always gravitated towards the outcasts, that was your dad's thing. He gravitated more to the outcast than the prima donnas.
I don't think Dad had any patience for arrogance or ego, or I think he was a real guy. I think my dad was, what you see is what you get. He was very transparent. He was not politically correct. He was not. He was an incredible diplomat for sure. But I think he. There was something in him that allowed him to relate to the everyman, as opposed to, you know, arrogance, ego, and that was where he was comfortable.
Tell me about your dad's childhood. What made Bill Bader into Bill Bader, the master promoter?
Well, that's a good question, because, you know, my dad went to an all-boys school. He went to St. Edward's in Cleveland. He was a big guy. By the time he was in high school, he was 6'4", 6'5", 280. The coach of the football team wanted him to play football. Grandma Bader would not allow him to play football. My father was, from the time he was very young, very mechanically inclined, always had cars, always worked on cars, intuitively understood how cars worked. He was a welder, he was a fabricator, he was a mechanic, and he was an entrepreneur. From a very young age, he worked at a gas station. He ended up owning that gas station. And I think my father, how would I describe my dad? He was an adventurist. He took risks. He was intrigued by things. He, at Grandma Bader's wish, he attended Dayton University. She wanted him to be a doctor, so he entered in a pre-med program at Dayton University. He didn't want to be a doctor. dropped out of school, came home. My father was an iron worker. My father owned a gas station. My father was a race car driver and a very competitive, very accomplished race car driver, competing in super modified. He traveled around the Midwest. He would dabble in everything from nightclubs to weight loss clinics. In the 1980s, he imported Italian mopeds. He owned a company called All Sport. My dad just never shied away from a challenge. And I don't know if every time opportunity knocked, my father answered the door. As to what drove him, his grandparents, Jito and Siti, came over on a boat from Lebanon, and Jito started a construction company in downtown Cleveland that became Joseph Construction, that became one of the largest contractors in Cuyahoga County. I just think something in the family drove this sense of achievement, driving yourself, pushing yourself to be better, to be all you can be. That sounds like obviously a U.S. Marine commercial, but the sense was if you were not overachieving, you were useless. And I think that's what drove. There's always there were things. My father and I worked alongside each other for 45 years. He would always impart wisdom, insight in little small doses here or there. Sometimes when you wanted to hear it, sometimes when you didn't. But I never asked him why he was like he was. He just was. That's how I knew him. Now, as a grandfather, the last 20 years, I became my dad, and that passion, that drive, that language, all that stuff. And I found my father saying, "Calm down, just relax, just calm down. It'll be okay." And I'm thinking, like, who the hell are you? You were the same guy that not that long ago was driving and pushing and crowding and expected us to work day and night without rest, without sleep, without food. And now all of a sudden he's the guy saying, "Bill, take it easy, relax." So somewhere along that line he crossed over, and my dad was like Superman. So the fact that he went back to this kind of mortal guy who we'd go over there for Christmas, and by 7:30 he'd have his arms crossed, sound asleep on the sofa, So, but I don't know what drove him, but he was a highly driven, highly motivated man for sure. And he had no use for people around him who were not built that same way, or who were weak, or who would accept mediocrity, or who would give it their almost all. He led from the front, and he expected everybody to approach their business or game day the same way he approached it. And it was unacceptable if you did not. Mistakes were not the issue. Failing due to lack of preparation, failing due to lack of laziness, failing due to just being, human was not acceptable. He expected more from us. Now, if you were giving 110% and you hadn't slept for 3 days and you were lying on the field exhausted and a mistake took place, he was also the same guy to go over, pick you up, dust you off, and tell you he loved you and, sent you back into the game. So my father was promoting a racetrack 15, 20 miles north of here, Sandusky Speedway. He was renting the facility from Dick Decker, and At that time, the Decker family had no interest in selling Dad Sandusky Speedway. And while that was happening, he received a call from Vince Schubert. And Vince had built the racetrack in 1963. It was closed. And Vince said, hey, we want to sell you this racetrack. My father was a round track racer his whole life. He had never seen a drag race. He had never been to a drag strip. And he bought the racetrack. He bought the racetrack, and in the spring of 1974, he started running races at the then called Norwalk Dragway. And again, remember, Bobby, when I said, when opportunity knocked, this was an opportunity. And he knew nothing about drag racing. I remember that first year, there were racers that would break out or red light. It was probably class racing back then, and they went too fast. Dad didn't think that was Dad didn't think that was fair, so he would put them back in. He would reinstate them, and you know as well as I do, Bobby, that can't happen. But remember, he came from a round track background where the goal was simple: to go as fast as you could for as long as you could, and there was a single line, a start-finish line. You start here, first racer to this start-finish line is the winner. So the idea of breaking out, the idea that racers had paid money to get in and they were done first round, because again, in round track racing, you had A mains, B mains, qualifiers. There isn't a one and done at a round track, but in drag racing, it's a one and done deal. If you have 500 racers in the pits, 250 of them are one and done. The casualty rate is high in drag racing. So there were a lot of lessons that needed to be learned, but my dad had two things that were hot buttons of his. Number one, promoters never did what they said they were going to do. And number two, promoters never started on time. And so that was my father's very simple business plan. We're going to always do what we say we're going to do, and we're always going to start on time. And that was the beginning of the Bader family and drag racing in the spring of 1974.
So he gets this visions of grandeur. I'm going to have a national event.
Mm-hmm.
There was no way in the world Norwalk Raceway Park or Norwalk Dragway was ready for a national event in 1981, right?
Right.
So tell me how Bill was so persistent to get what he wanted.
I think my dad... There was one thing that my father would exceed all others in, and that was he was not going to be outworked. The man would not be outworked. He may not have always been the brightest guy in the room, but you were not going to outwork my dad. And so he was the most persistent, determined, hardworking guy. And I think IHRA, Larry Carrier, Ted Jones, I think I would have to ask Ted, but my guess is they reacted to that. That resonated with them. And my father made commitments. He delivered on those commitments. And we had our first IHRA World Nationals. The facility was not what it was today, but the facility was always neat, clean, beautifully manicured, mowed, trimmed. I don't remember what our seating capacity was back then. I don't know, 8,000 people maybe a little less in 1981. But my father, everything that was asked of him by the IHRA at that time, my father did. And he just worked. I remember, and I think it was the first national event. We had an old, beat-up facility truck that didn't have any doors on it, and I was sitting in the back of the truck, and this was at 2 a.m. or 3 a.m., and we were spraying the racetrack. So we had drums of glue in the truck, And in those days, you didn't have sprayers and all of that stuff. So you walked behind the truck and you applied it by hand with like a paint sprayer. And that's what we did in the middle of the night. And I remember the overspray was so incredible. Two things I remember from that. Number one, the overspray, I had boots on and jeans, and I could not get my pant legs separated from the boots. So everything had to be cut off because everything was so stuck together, because we did that for 2,600 feet. We sprayed 2 lanes, multiple applications. You know, back in the day, you would apply VHT the night before to give it cure time. The other thing I remember about that night was there was this little short guy with long hair and a long mustache that wandered out onto the track in the middle of the night while we were out there spraying. And he said, "What are you guys doing?" And we said, "We're spraying the racetrack." That was Dale Poldy. And that was the first time I met Dale Poldy, was that night. So I was 13 years old and working in the middle of the night with my dad, prepping the racetrack, and that's when I met Dale.
Now, I seem to remember that your return road was not paved.
Probably not. No, probably not.
No, you're.
Well, no, it probably wasn't, Bobby, because we had back then most of the pit area was gravel, and it wasn't little gravel. It was big, giant, ankle breaking type gravel that we had in the pit area, and we had an old water truck, and so we constantly ran the water truck to water to keep dust down.
So Ted Jones gets here, and it's like a week before the event. Yeah, he came up and said, "Yeah, we got a race. Everything will be ready." How far off of being ready were you guys 2 weeks before the national event?
Oh, I'm sure. Bobby, we had no staff. It was Dad. It was Deb. We had Dick Libby, who was a part-time facility guy in 1981. By getting ready, that meant Dad, Dick Libby, any children that, and in May he pulled us out of school. So because the first IHRA World Nationals were in the spring, we rained out the first several of them. So, free labor, right? Pull your kids out of school and put them to work. So my guess is those were, we were spraying the track at 3 a.m. My dad, the week of the first national event, my father pulled me out of school, and my father said, "I'm going to pick you. You're not going to school this week, and I'm picking you up at 6 a.m. And he picked me up every morning at 6 a.m. and we came into work, and I was so exhausted that I missed the first race because I was a little kid, and I had just worked 20 to 22 hour days for 4 or 5 days straight. And that's when I got that's when I got indoctrinated in how to work for Bill Bader.
Those would have been so bad, they would have broken child labor laws back in the 1920s.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But, didn't care. That year I remember, or in the early years of the IHRA World Nationals, because the event eventually moved out of May. It rained out a period of years in a row. And I don't know, Bobby, if it went right from May to August or it had an interim period before it landed the last weekend in August. But because most of the years of the World Nationals, it was always the last weekend in August before Indy. But we'd be out there in the pouring rain, and he would give us big garbage bags, and he would say, "Cut holes in this and put it over your head and put your arms through it." That was our rain gear, so to speak, because we didn't have money for pants and jackets and stuff like that. And he would roll down the job truck. Later, we had a truck with doors. So he would roll down the window and he would heave out some hamburgers and say, eat while you keep working, eat while you work. It was all hands on deck and it was all hours.
The only thing he was missing, it seemed like, was the whip.
Yeah, there was no whip. But I'll tell you what my dad had the uncanny ability to do was people around him would elevate their game. He had the ability to get people to find a different gear, find a different, he found a way to get you to raise your expectation for yourself. He found a way to motivate you to the point where you didn't want, it wasn't that you were letting him down, it was that you were letting yourself down, which you didn't want to happen, because you had this larger than life, charismatic guy who was out there ahead of you. It wasn't like he was calling you on a cell phone from a remote island. He was out there doing the work too. And he was able to find a different gear in every human being that came across him, and just a tremendous gift.
What was it like, the transition from you taking over his prize, almost like another child?
It was a child of his.
What was it like, that transition from him to you? Like, was it like a deal, son, I'm going to give this to you, don't screw it up? Or
No. So here was the plan. In the early 90s, we had a conversation and he said, hey, is this something you want to continue? And I thought about it, and of course I wanted to continue what my father started. I wanted to honor his work, and so I said to him, yes, I want to continue this. And that dovetailed into the desire to continue to spend money in the facility. That was when we added the big 40-row grandstand on the Budweiser side of the racetrack. We built a beautiful bathroom and shower facility. We built the quarter-mile clothing company. We built a guest service location, and those were in the 90s that we did those things. So based on my commitment, he started reinvesting larger sums of money into the facility. In 1994, Grandma Bader got sick, and my father said, hey, I'm going to kind of step back, and I want to spend more time with Grandma. And that was really the transition. The plan was to never formally announce the transition from Dad to me. It was just going to happen in a very subtle fashion, very quietly. Well, then the opportunity to purchase the IHRA came up, and right before Christmas, he makes the trip to Bristol, Tennessee, does his due diligence, and purchases the International Hot Rod Association. He comes back right before Christmas. He meets with us. And then he has a meeting with me, and he essentially tossed me the keys and said, here. But there were a couple things that were challenging about that. Number one, now there was a formal transition as opposed to a subtle transition. So there was a moment in time where Bill Bader Sr. was leaving Norwalk Raceway, He was moving the International Hot Rod Association to Norwalk, Ohio, and obviously he was leaving here. The second thing that happened was he drained most of the talent out of Norwalk Raceway Park because he took it with him to IHRA. And this was a big facility then. In 1998, we had substantial events. We had a big night under fire. We had a Halloween Classic. We had an incredibly successful Super Chevy show. This was a busy place. This was an 80 to 90 event facility, and all of these people, the leadership team essentially all left. And his feeling, he didn't really give a shit, Bobby. His feeling was I would sort it out. And I had some really tough years because we wanted to not just maintain, we wanted to continue to exceed the bar. And so I had to cultivate a new team that was going to be my team. And there were some people that were pretty unforgiving of that transitionary time. People that were very outspoken about the fact that I would never be my dad, and it was a very difficult transition for me. And I outworked it. I just outworked it. I was dedicated. I was passionate. I was a hell of a lot younger. Yeah. So I was 27 years old. Here are the keys. We had a very brief meeting in his office. I was sitting on the opposite side, and he took this blue mechanical pencil and he said, "Here, I want you to remember, you can't always run one of these with this." And he handed me his keys and left, and moved the IHRA to Norwalk, Ohio, onto Main Street, on the second floor of the National City Bank building, and we were on our way. IHRA was on its way. I was on my way in my new official capacity. Probably it took me 5 to 8 years to really get settled in, and for people to accept me, because I was not my dad, and people there were some people that had a hard time with that, and I had a hard time with that. That was tough because these were all people that were my friends, co-workers, teammates, guests, racers, but when that formal announcement took place, Bobby, those relationships all changed, and so it was a lot. It was painful. It was, it was heartbreaking, but I was just not going to fail. That was it. I was not going to fail. And then we kind of settled in. We established a management team, good people, hardworking people. We had, pre-COVID, we had 26 full-time people working at this racetrack and 430 event staff. The company has grown since Dad, since 1994. The company has grown 500%, and so I feel like I did my dad proud, but it was a tough road.
Do you think that Bill's tossing of the keys and taking your staff with him was his way of tossing you into the lake and saying, "Hey kids, sink or swim"?
When I was 13 or 14, my dad handed me a sheet of paper with directions and keys to a truck, and he said, "Hey, I need you to go to North Olmsted and get red and white paint," because back then Winston was the series sponsor of the IHRA, and part of the deal was that you got all the free red and white paint you could ever hope for. And that's why everything was red and white at the racetrack, because it was free. So at 14, my dad sends me as the primary driver with nobody with me to a suburb of Cleveland, Ohio, 50 minutes away, down I-480 to pick up paint. So whether it was that tossing into the lake or...
Oh, hold on, time out. Did he realize you didn't have a license?
Oh yeah, he knew. But I was the only guy available to go, and he needed the paint. My father just always expected more. He just expected more. And I asked him years later about that, and he said, I knew you'd be fine. I mean, I could have died. I could have taken a wrong turn and ended up in another state. I was a kid. So when he handed me the keys, I guess he was supremely confident, you know, and maybe that was the message, you know.
But there are several different controversies involved. One, of course, is yet another rules change. The other is too many rules changes. The first person we went to was, of course, Bill Bader, to get the facts. Explain the reasoning behind the 100-pound weight increase for the supercharged nostalgia cars.
Looking at the performance of the nostalgia cars in New England, told me clearly that the number one nostalgia car was running he was running 34, 34, 36 on Sunday in the daylight, not at the hero numbers we see on Sunday night sometimes, or rather, Saturday night at the night of fire, but on Sunday. Looking at the cars closest to him, they were running about a tenth behind him. I felt that in order to help level that playing field, I didn't want to make those drivers go through another mechanical change that could lead to broken parts and internal difficulties. The easiest way to gain that tenth was to use weight. 100 pounds of weight, I was told by our tech people, would equal about a tenth of a second, maybe 7/100ths of a second in ET loss.
Your dad, based on his success at building this track from nothing to a grand empire, he did realize that running a sanctioning body was totally different from running a racetrack, right?
My dad had no manufacturing experience when he started Allsport. My father had never imported anything in his life when he imported Califo mopeds from Italy. My father had never owned a nightclub until he owned the Friendly Corners. He was the embodiment of the entrepreneur. And I think I just think my father was fearless, you know, and I think my dad always assumed my dad took in his toolbox every time opportunity knocked, he took to every time he answered that door, he was confident in himself. He knew that he wouldn't be outworked. He knew he would be dedicated. He knew he would be passionate. He knew he would work 24 hours a day for however many days in a row. And I think he had become, as a track owner, he had climbed every mountain he could climb. And I think this was the next challenge in his career. I don't think he knew that it would be so much more. But he wasn't afraid of it. He just did the work. And you know, Debbie Bader has said many times that my father had to draw upon every ounce of experience and knowledge he had learned in every aspect of his life and in every business and in every experience. He needed all of that he needed to be armed with all of that in order to be successful at IHRA. I think my dad probably, it's sad you can't ask him this, but my guess is that my dad probably got a little more than he bargained for, I think. And, but what an accomplishment, you know? I mean, IHRA was on its way. It was on its way, and it was on its way in a grand style. It was not on its way limping along. It was skyrocketing, and it's just incredible.
Your dad never said, I think I've probably bitten off more than I could chew
No.
But could you see that in his eyes?
Bobby, when that day where he handed me the keys, even though his office was in Norwalk and my office was in Norwalk, and at that point we were neighbors. We were living right next to each other in Norwalk, Ohio, on the south side of Norwalk on Ridge Road. I never saw my dad. I went months without seeing my dad. I was fully immersed in what I was doing. He was fully immersed in what he was doing. All I know is my dad worked lots of 20-hour days. There were lots of times that we didn't have texting back then. We didn't have, so all I knew was he was still alive and working his ass off, and he apparently knew I was still alive and working my ass off. And I don't know that my father would have ever said that I've bitten off more than I could chew. I think my father would have simply just worked harder, Now
he sold the IHRA, sold his stake in it, and he went on to retire.
Yeah, he did.
And so about this same time, you decided to step away from the IHRA. How did that go over with him? Because you were leaving his organization, or the organization he built or helped build to the point it was at, and settling into retirement. I mean, there was a lot going on.
So I remember when we had a meeting, we had a family meeting to talk about the sale of IHRA to Clear Channel. And there was lots of discussion, and I was involved in all of that. And we looked at the power of Clear Channel. We looked at their strength. We looked at, they had 800,000 outdoor billboards. They had radio stations. They had monster trucks. They owned talent. They were the marketing muscle that IHRA needed to become the preeminent sanctioning body. We all believed that, and we all thought that was the right thing to do. We made that decision, and I learned a valuable lesson in all of that bigger is not better. This is a different animal. Motorsports is a different animal. Drag racing is a unique animal within the motorsports space, and drag racing my father was planting seeds, and he was nurturing, and he was watering, and he was it needed strong roots, and we were strengthening our roots, and it was starting to sprout, and it was starting to grow. We thought that Clear Channel would be the last remaining element from good to great, and that proved to not be true, because whenever you bring in a company that is owned by shareholders, it's all about dividends and earnings per share and things like that. And it became challenging during those years because my father was still planting and watering, and bean counters are absolutely the number one enemy of drag racing. It's not Mother Nature, it's accountants. And that was what my father was saying to me in 1998 when he held up his pencil and said, "You can't always run one of these with this." And he knew it, I knew it, we knew it. Clear Channel wanted a dividend. They wanted an earnings per share. There were some tough years in there. My father retires in 04, November of 04. And that summer, I reached out to Tom Compton, the president of the National Hot Rod Association, and I convinced him that 50% of Norwalk would be worth more than 100% of National Trail Raceway. And I didn't tell my dad. I didn't tell anybody. The only people that knew were myself, Tom Compton, and God. It was one of drag racing's best kept secrets. And in October or November of '04, my father steps down. He receives a call, a very complimentary call from Tom Compton, congratulating Dad on his retirement. And he says, I've been talking to your son about an NHRA national event. And my father was completely floored. He had no idea. He was the president of IHRA. And he called me and he said, "What the fuck are you doing?" He was furious with me. And he said, "Bill, you're wasting your time. It will never happen. It will never happen. They will never give up a facility they own to come to Norwalk." And I said, "Okay, if that's what you believe, that's what you believe, but you're wrong." And he said, "It'll never happen. You're wasting your time." And I took that as a freaking challenge at that point. And in June of 2007, we hosted the inaugural Summit Racing Equipment NHRA Nationals.
When you switched sanctions, then did it hit your dad?
I think, so Bobby, let me step back. In the 80s, my father met with the NHRA Division III Director, Bob Daniels. I believe they met at a Holiday Inn and had dinner. And my father expressed to the NHRA that he wanted to host an NHRA national event. And Bob Daniels told my dad that there was no way in hell he was ever going to host an NHRA national event. And I remember, Bobby, even when we made the announcement after the IHRA World Nationals in '06, there were media that questioned it. The facility wasn't big enough. The facility wasn't ready. There were a lot of naysayers after that press conference in 2006. But Bob Daniels looked my dad in the eye and said, "You'll never host an NHRA national event." So I think my father, listen, IHRA was very good to our family for a long, long time. I knew my father was stepping down, and this was going to be our opportunity. And so I took it, and it started out as a general conversation, and then it got more intense and became more real and became more real. And, we had versions of contracts in '05. The plan was to announce right after the IHRA World Nationals that we were moving to the National Hot Rod Association beginning in '07. I laid the foundation for some of that stuff by switching from Pepsi to Coke and trying to align some of our majors with NHRA. That was when people really started to wonder what was going on, because we were a Pepsi track our whole life, and out of the clear blue, we're a Coke track. We started to, but again, nobody knew. Nobody knew what was happening. And finally, when it started to become a reality, I think my father was pretty proud.
Bill Bader, this is his family's track here. They spent nearly $6 million getting this ready for this event, Dave Reef.
And as I get a chance to talk with Bill Bader, the man who took over this facility back in 1973, co-owns it now with his son, we're talking about the investment, $6 million you pumped into this place with the hopes that it might turn out. Well, as I look around, I think it's turning out just fine.
It turned out spectacular, well above our anticipation. There's an old saying, we talk about income, we talk about ifcome. We felt income was conservative, and we planned a 10-year payback. This ifcome became income today, and clearly it's greater than anything we imagined before.
I asked him if he would, he had retired in '04. I asked him if he would come back in '06 and oversee the expansion, because I had plenty of front of house stuff to do. We had to merge an IHRA World Nationals seating chart with a Pontiac Excitement National seating chart. We had this incredible influx of sponsorship. there was an incredible buzz. We had to launch and get tickets on sale. We had to, so there was plenty, and we were a small staff compared to what we are now in 2006, because that was 18 years ago. So I wasn't prepared for the onslaught and the enthusiasm and the questions and the anticipation and the doubt and the naysayers. And so I was handling all of that, and Dad was quietly spending $8 million to upgrade the facility. What was supposed to be a $4 million expansion became a $7.8 million expansion. And, you know, at that time, I was the majority owner of the company. I owned more shares than my father did, but that doesn't when your dad is your partner, as you can probably imagine. So, you know, my father decides to pave 30 acres, not 15 acres. He decides that we're going to tie into city sewer. That's $600,000. He decides that we're going to have two-sided scoreboards. He decides, and I said, listen, what the F are we doing? Well, I only borrowed $3.2 million. And he said, it'll be okay. And I said, so he came, so he got to be part of it, which was really cool. I would have not had the same debt picture had I picked somebody else to do it, not my dad, but it was such a cool thing. And we knew by that time, Bobby, we could not have joint responsibility. We needed to have very defined responsibility where he wasn't in my world and I wasn't in his. So, and I remember in May of 2007, all the pavement was fresh. All of it was black. The white stripes were beautiful. We had new suites. The place has never looked so good as it did that day. And I remember sitting with him in the grandstands, and he said, it's a shame we have to open, because he knew that there would be tire tracks on the pavement, and he knew that right now everything was pristine and perfect. And obviously he knew that we had to open, but he said, it's a shame that we have to open this place, that we can't just leave it like this. And he was so proud. And then at the inaugural race in 2007, you know, in IHRA, we always had a problem selling Sunday tickets. We were packed on Saturday. On Saturday, this facility, we had more people than we had seats. Sunday, you could shoot a cannon off and not harm anybody. And on Sunday, the place was packed. We had our largest event attendance in our history at that point, a multiple day event. And Sunday was sold out. And I remember looking at my dad, giving him a hug, giving him a kiss. And I said, well, I guess we don't have to worry about Sunday. We don't have to worry ever again about selling tickets to Sunday of our national event. And, you know, and the rest is history.
The Bader family has spent millions of dollars to get ready for their very first ever NHRA national event, and they've already been rewarded. The crowd just pouring in here, ready to see what's going on. It's a great track, and it has its special merits. How about a pound of ice cream for $1? Let me tell you, I don't think that it gets much better than that. It's the inaugural Summit Racing Equipment Nationals from Summit Motorsports Park.
We were on the starting line, and the first pair of fuel cars, I think, had already done their burnout, and people. It was, Bobby. It was the most perfect moment in my life. It was just it was the culmination of everything that our family had worked for. And there we were on Sunday, and I just said to my dad, you got your NHRA national event. And, you know, you got your race, the race that you wanted, that Bob Daniels told you you could never have. And Bobby, that's why I did it. That's why I did it. And it wasn't for any other reason than I felt the greatest gift I could give my dad.
All right, we have breaking news now. Let's get to it. It has to do with COVID-19. And the World Health Organization has just declared a global coronavirus. It is a pandemic at this point. Let's talk about what that means. The criteria of a pandemic describes the worldwide spread of a new disease, involves a new virus against which most people do not yet have any immunity. Virus can infect people easily and spreads person to person. We are seeing those things. It implies efforts to contain an outbreak in a region or country have failed. A pandemic describes how widespread an illness is, not how necessarily lethal it is. The WHO has said it is tightening its criteria for classifying an outbreak as a pandemic and is working on a new definition as it relates to coronavirus.
2020, no one could have ever anticipated 2020 and all that it would mean, and the life-altering events that followed. But March of 2020, we realized that we're under our first stay-at-home order, and I remember my wife saying to our team, hey, this is only going to be a few weeks. And I said to Jamie, I said, no, it's not. This is going to be a life-altering summer. Ultimately, I make the decision to pull the plug on the season. And I think my father was mad at me in the beginning for that. And then but he was in Idaho. He had not stepped foot on property at this racetrack since 2015. The company was far bigger. It was far more complex. We couldn't turn on a dime. We weren't, not that we were the Titanic, but we weren't a dinghy anymore, and we weren't as nimble. I tried to keep us nimble, but with 26 full-time people and 430 event staff, and the structure of Summit Motorsports Park, so we ceased operations for the year. Our fans, racers, the amount of support we received, I cannot adequately convey into words. Checks started flying in from people that just wanted to contribute. I returned all of those checks with heartfelt, handwritten thank yous. The vast majority, 99% of people held their tickets. They didn't ask for refunds. Everybody, the community, team members, racers, guests, everybody just kind of helped. They all did their part.
But that's because of the foundation your father laid.
Sure, absolutely, absolutely. And the sense that we would always do what we said we were going to do. There was always a value component to everything that we offered, and people believed in us, and they wanted us to succeed. So we get through 20 by the grace of God, and through the incredible help of a multitude, thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people. And we go into 21, and in January and in February, I mean, ticket sales were through the roof, sponsorship, people were excited, and 2021 ended up being a banner year for Summit Motorsports Park, and should have been a banner year for lots of outdoor entertainment venues. So we go into 21, February, March. I had no idea that we were going to experience the kind of labor interruptions, supply chain interruptions. I couldn't get people to work. I just couldn't get people to come to work for love nor money. And, Cedar Point in the spring announces $20 an hour. And then Kalahari hops on, and of course we're in a tourist area, and they create this vortex in the community, in the labor pool. And so we're in trouble. And I asked my dad if he would come back and help at Night Under Fire in August. And I think he was thrilled to be asked. And so it's like his plane lands in Cleveland and there's this tremor. You can just feel it because Bill Bader Sr. is back in Ohio. And he comes out to the racetrack and it's like Grant took Richmond. It's this whirlwind of energy, and he's barking out direction, and he's on the property 30 minutes, and it's like the earth alters its axis. And I said to him, listen to me. I just asked you to come back and run the race. Can you just do what I asked you to do? Can you just run the race? Okay, I'll just run the race. So Saturday morning of the Night Under Fire, he's, and keep in mind, Bobby, at that point, he had been gone for 27 years from this racetrack. There were our leadership team, management people, event staff, racers that knew of my dad, but had never met my dad. And probably some people who didn't know my dad. So he's the new commander-in-chief, right? And apparently I'm working for him at that point. And we were, we needed to find our way, father and son, which we do in the middle of what ended up being the biggest Night Under Fire in our history. And now keep in mind, the events in August were short-staffed. We're working our ass off, working ridiculous hours. And I've been living this life now all year. Dad's been out in Idaho on a mountain, and he comes rolling in all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. And so we have some challenges at the event. We had a power outage and all kinds of stuff. So we meet on Monday to recap, and he gives me 2 pages of notes of things that he sees wrong while he's here. And it's a show car coordinator who doesn't have a shirt fully tucked in, and it's a park services team member who doesn't have a name tag, and it's all that. And I just went off like a rocket ship. I was furious with him. And I said, don't you think I know that? Don't you think I see all that? Well, I don't know what you see or don't see. And I said, well, trust me, I see it all, and I don't need to have my nose rubbed in it by my dad. And he said, well, there was a note here, electric box number whatever, the breaker needs to be replaced. Did you know that? And I said, well, I didn't know that. But I just didn't need to hear it, because it was, I just felt like it was piling on. And I told him, I said, listen, if you want to climb down off your damn mountain and sit in my chair, I'm all for it, because I would happily find something else to do. And we had one of the most heated exchanges we've had in a long, long time. But my dad only knew how to do things one way, and he couldn't shut it off. He couldn't help himself, and before he hopped on the plane to go back to Idaho, we were fine. I knew my dad's heart. He knew mine. We were, it was all good. I told him I loved him. He did ask me, he said, are you going to bring me back next year? And I said, I don't know. I'll let you, I said, I don't know right now. I'll let you know. And he said, okay. And that was it. He hopped on a plane, went back to Idaho, and I saw him at Thanksgiving. My dad came back he was always at home for Thanksgiving and Christmas, and then after Christmas he would go back to Idaho.
You have to have feeling, you have to have emotion, you have to have passion. We have to recognize that the business we're in, and it is a business, it's also a love. But what we are in is making people forget their problems, their sorrows, and their woes, and enjoying each other, enjoying their family, enjoying their spouses and their loved ones. You can use a pencil to stay in business. You have to use it to be sure that the income and expense makes sense. But you can't do it in creating the experience for your fan. You've got to look at that fan and realize that he has choices. He can stay home, he can go camping, fishing, boating, he can do yard work, he can spend time with his family having a picnic in the backyard.
Drag racing, he never understood my involvement in drag racing. He used to come and talk to me. He worked, he knew how to do one thing: get up in the morning, work, go to bed at night, take care of your family, and he was very influential in the church. He tried to tell me, Billy, you need to get a job. You have a wife, you have children. You can't do this. And I said, Dad, it'll be okay. The good Lord took him home. He didn't get married, he was 35, he didn't have me till he was 40. So my younger brother, he was 60 years old, raising a teenager. I know my dad, if he were alive, would be proud tonight.
The three things I preach are faith, family, and finance. In that order. We get it so mixed up. And we start working on putting a roof over their head, food on the table, clothes on their back. And we forget about our faith. That kind of drops to the bottom, but family still stays second, not first, and not ahead of finance. And that needs to be, I mean, I'm a strong cradle Catholic. Our faith has got to be first, but our family, as we get older in life, it's our children, it's our spouse, our friend, it's the relationships we've built with that family that make the difference in really in what kind of people we are.
Bill Bader Sr. would want to be remembered as an honest, trustworthy, honorable, hardworking man who had a genuine care and love for people. That's it. I think that's how my dad, I think that's how Bill Bader Sr. would want to be remembered.